Hi everyone, my name is Erin Berry, and I have a unique perspective to offer on boys who have been victims of commercial sexual exploitation, trafficking, sexual abuse, from different points of view that I might be able to answer your questions about. My legal career started as a prosecutor on the adult side, prosecuting the perpetrators. I then went to the DA juvenile division, prosecuting juveniles and seeing that, in fact, a lot of them were victims. And then I just finished a 4-year stint as in-house counsel for the Bexar County Juvenile Probation Department, where I served as legal counsel to our chief probation officer and oversaw the all of our specialty court for victims of trafficking, our field services for victims of trafficking, and all the other things that come with the programming and services around victims of this sexual exploitation. Over the past 3 years at Juvenile, I was also partnering with a local nonprofit organization called Maas Youth Alternatives, who already had a residential treatment facility and emergency shelter serving CPS kids. And they were fortunate. We wrote a grant, juvenile probation. We applied for a grant with the governor's office 2 years ago now to operate a drop-in center, and we contracted with Roy Maas to run that drop-in center for runaway youth and victims of trafficking, high-risk youth, basically any kid who wants to come through the door or law enforcement brings in, any way that we could keep them off the street. And in that, through the past 3 years, the grant initially funded the drop-in center for 8 hours a day. I spent several hours pounding the pavement and knocking on doors, begging private foundations to give money so that we could keep this drop-in center open 24 hours, which it has been now for the last year. And last week, yes, it's great, we've had over 265 children walk through those doors in the last year. And last week, I'm getting the goosebumps. I'm going to start crying. I'm so excited. We worked so hard for this. Last week, we opened an emergency shelter for child trafficking victims. I'm really happy because it's been a lot of hard work by all of our partners. The Alamo Area Coalition Against Trafficking, Juvenile Probation, Bexar County Sheriff, SAPD, and then all the service providers, Ransom Life, Child Safe, Rape Crisis Center, and of course, Roy Maas Youth Alternatives. And so this has been a textbook example of private-public partnership coming together to serve this youth. We operate in a multidisciplinary team for care coordination and law enforcement. And we have also secured funding to do an information sharing platform in the cloud, which enables all of the partners, anyone who comes into contact with one of these children, to enter in information on that child real time, so we know where they are, who their advocate is, who their doctor is. You don't need to ask the child a million questions over again and over again. So we're really excited about that. It's for Bexar County right now, and if it works out, we're hoping to get funding to extend it across the state. I know Commissioner Whitman just signed the MOU, so TDFPS is on board in Bexar County. So it's really groundbreaking. I'm really proud of what we've done. Yesterday was my first official day as the Director of Child Sex Trafficking Programs and Services for Roy Maas Youth Alternatives. So I went from juvenile to our partner, and I haven't even been in my office yet, but I'm officially on the payroll. I'm actually my office is in the drop-in center, which I'm super excited about. I can see the front door from my desk, and so I'm really looking forward to this next endeavor, and I can answer questions about boys are being trafficked, how to get this kind of operation started in your region. Anything that you heard me say that you might have a question about, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions.
Thank you. You're a hard act to follow, Erin. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Gilbert. I am the Chief Partner Relations Officer at the Dallas Children's Advocacy Center. I oversee our multidisciplinary services team, which provides support to our multidisciplinary team for both child abuse, including child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, child fatalities, and now just in the last year and a half, child sex trafficking. And so we're glad to be a part of this discussion. Our coordinator coordinators work tirelessly. We have 2 coordinators and a director of that program to really provide support to our very important partners. One of those is sitting right next to me from Traffic 911, and I know that our coordinators work closely with the advocates that respond when a child who is either the alleged victim of child sex trafficking or someone who has been identified as a high-risk youth is recovered from the streets. And so I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all, and I'll hand it over to George.
Thank you, Matt. I'm George Lynch. I'm the CEO of Traffic 911. We are an organization that for 10 years has been in the fight to free youth from sex trafficking. We offer prevention, programming, and youth detentions and schools, youth shelters across the state of Texas. And here in North Texas, our home counties in Dallas County, Tarrant County, hopefully in the counties moving north, we provide crisis response to youth that have been recovered from trafficking situations by law enforcement and hospitals and the Department of Family Protective Services in order to walk along with a young person and see them move on into who they are meant to be. And we have had the privilege in this last year of serving 161 children from Dallas County and Tarrant County. That means every 3 days, a child right here in the communities that we live and work in, if you're from this area, a child is being recovered. And so this issue is here. Of the 161, this last year, 5 of our recovered victims were young boys. So it's an issue that we're beginning to see in our caseload. And I just want to thank Erin for proving that against the perception that lawyers don't have a heart, they clearly can get emotional. This is good.
My name is Tomi Grover, and I have been an educator and a researcher on human trafficking since about 2006, when my life was gloriously ruined by this topic. And as of August 6th of 2018, I now serve as the North Texas Regional Administrator for the Governor's Child Sex Trafficking Team. And as a part of what they give me, allow me, can't do without me, kind of, you know, for the better, for the worse, is the academic part of finding the research. And I told him when I got hired, I'm going to push you on the research. I'm going to push you. And I continue to do that every day. And so it's information brokering that I do quite a bit of for the team, but I cover the 48 counties in North Texas. And so we're doing a lot of amazing things. I can't wait to meet many of you who are on the journey to help provide services, as well as those of you who are doing a variety of other things in the North Texas region. And when questions come up about what was happening with boys, I went immediately and started doing research on what's out there, who's been doing the research and that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of where I'll fit in this wheelhouse today.
Good afternoon. My name is Cliff Manning. I'm a captain with DPS-CID. I'm the Human Trafficking Program Manager for the state of Texas. Prior to that, I was the Human Trafficking Task Force Supervisor in Houston for about 8 years. And I found out about this about 5 minutes ago. I told Alan, I said, don't start with me, start down there, and maybe you should have started with me because I don't want to follow any of these people. The outstanding work being done. But I'll try to answer any questions y'all have.
So we're going to begin talking about, this is specifically focused as much as we can be on boys. So let's start with the identification piece. And since his mic is still warm, we're going to go back to Cliff to ask the question of what are you seeing in law enforcement operations and investigations regarding the trafficking of boys?
Wow, that's a tough question. And actually, this was a discussion I had with Alan prior to taking this seat. So obviously, from the law enforcement standpoint, we know it's out there. We know what's going on. In Houston, I'm sure all of y'all have heard of Bissonnette, the Strip, the Strand. I mean, there's all types of different lingo to use to describe this area. It's known nationwide, if not worldwide, so if you want anything to do with sex in exchange for money, that's the place you go. And DPS has done a ton of work down in that area with HPD Vice, HPD Human Trafficking, their CRU units. And to be honest, we just haven't seen it. I can't say that we've actively gone out and looked specifically for boys, but when you're down in that area, looking for those exchanging sex for money, it would be obvious that that is what's going on. Now, that being said, there's a lot of individuals out there that definitely need the help. You have a lot of, I'm going to get it right, transgender individuals that are working out there, but for on the specific side of it, at least in Houston, we're not seeing a whole lot of it. We've received a lot of NICMIC leads, a handful of NICMIC leads that are specifically boys that are victims of human trafficking that we've attempted to locate without success. We continue into just like a lot of law enforcement, our expertise in the area of dealing with boys is climbing, and our focus has shifted away from just, initially when I took over the task force in Houston, it was child sex trafficking was my goal. And initially, I'm going to be honest, I wasn't aware of the boy side of it. And I think probably most of those in law enforcement would probably say the same thing. We weren't aware of it. But the child part of it was readily apparent, and that's what the goal was. It has since shifted where the NICMIC leads are starting to come out now, the awareness is starting to come out, and we're actively looking for it. But that's, I guess, my limited experience with the Boyd side of it. And hopefully in Houston, as awareness comes out, awareness in the public comes out, our success rate with the boys will start to reflect that. The mic is not hot.
Erin, do you want to speak to what you're seeing happening both with your experience in Bear County Juvenile, but also at Roy Maas?
Yeah, I'm going to stand up. I like to be able to see everyone. We don't rely on tools to quote-unquote identify boys. The tool we're currently using, the Commercial Sexual Exploitation Identification Tool, otherwise known as the CEIT, has questions on it, like has the individual been forced to forced to get pregnant or have an abortion, which obviously doesn't apply to our boys. So there are some aspects of it that don't fit the boys' questions about does this individual indicate that they're in a relationship with someone who controls them? Boys just don't want to admit that. So we, at juvenile, if someone suspected it, we provided the same services as we would as a heterosexual female victim to that boy. They didn't need to provide us any evidence or say, yes, this is happening to me. You all work in this industry, and what was the Supreme Court justice who said, when you see it, you know it, when it comes to pornography? When you see it, you know it. And so you don't need to rely on a tool to tell you, yes, this boy needs services. So they've been treated the same at juvenile. They go through the same specialty courts, and they get the services they need. At Roy Maas, the drop-in center, like I said, has had over 250 children come through the front door in the last year, and 46%, I believe, I know it's in the mid-40s, are male. So those are runaways, or kids being brought in by law enforcement, and we all know that 1 in 3 children are lured into trafficking within 72 hours of running away. So if you look at that percentage, there's got to be boys, obviously, that are being sexually exploited, and we know they are. Again, at Roy Maas, we treat them the same. They get the same services. They get whatever we offer the girls, we offer the boys and tailor it to their needs. I think you'll find with boys, from my experience with juvenile, it's a lot more of the exploitation. It's there's also the gangs making other boys engage in the compelling of prostitution, engage in the raping of girls. And when you're in a gang, you have no choice. So they're kind of a victim. They're a victim, even though they're perpetrating. And in our eyes, they're a victim too, because they're being forced to engage in this contact that they don't want to engage in, even though it's illegal, and they can be charged with it. So that was another big issue we saw at juvenile, was boys being forced to engage in the harming of these young girls, 12 years old, and they really didn't want to. And so by virtue of that, they became victims themselves. So that's always that's traumatic. That's really very traumatic for those boys. So we acknowledge that there's that population too. And again, Bexar County Juvenile Probation has been serving this population for years and has had a specialty court since 2013, so they're very well equipped. It's very easy for people to bash the juvenile justice system, saying they're criminalizing these kids. And I don't know about other counties, but Bexar County has been on the forefront of providing services. And if a child was being trafficked, the chances are they were getting services because they went into juvenile justice, where they wouldn't have otherwise had they not picked up an offense, unfortunately. And so the specialty court allows them to work through a program over a year and then get their charges dismissed. So, but yeah, the boys, again, we don't rely on a tool. When you see it, you know it, and you provide services accordingly.
Tomi, next question really needs to start at the macro level, the treetops perspective on what around the country we're learning about boys being identified as victims. So again, I'm purposefully using that word because part of what I'd like you to speak to is, in our society, is it an oxymoron to talk about males as victims because of all the cultural norms that we've established? And what is the research telling us about that?
So there's several different studies that have been done, and when you think of a study, I want you to be thinking of a picture, as if you're standing, taking a snapshot of something. I was looking at the sunrise the other day, and there was a fog in the atmosphere, and it looked like the moon was coming up, and it was actually the sun that was coming up. And sometimes our vision of what we are seeing is clouded by things that is either because the snapshot can't be put in time and space correctly, or that there's other obstacles or distractions that keep you from recognizing something that's there, right? So in the world of research, when we start looking at things, we don't know what the filters or the fogs are between us and the object that we're trying to study. And the snapshots often don't take into account what is clouding their view of what they're trying to see. And a part of that is been recognized by various studies that have been done. There are some studies that have been done specifically on boys in New York. When you start to look at the threads of how the research was done, they had to identify that some of the ways that they were conducting their research was actually creating some fog, if you will, for what they were finding. And because of that, their results have been really attacked in many ways. Even the study on estimates that was done here in Texas. We study estimates because people need to know, this like, show me the numbers, show me the money. They go hand in hand oftentimes, and if we can't produce numbers, then we're not going to get any funding. But those are all clouding our vision of what the realities are, and so we get disturbed by what's there. And estimates have had a place in the understanding of trafficking globally and locally, but they can't be the only thing that we rely on. And so when it comes to understanding these issues, one of the things that has risen to the surface is that we haven't been looking through the lenses that allow us to see what's actually there. Our vision has been clouded, and much of that has to do with what I would say misrepresent in our society, that boys have agency when it comes to being victimized, that they had to have had some ability to overpower or to reject being sexually exploited, when in actuality as a child they didn't have any agency, that they were put into a position of having to participate for whether it's survival sex or whether it's familial trafficking. I have a need, you need to do this kind of thing. And really we have culturally framed this in such a way that boys they're not allowed to cry, we know that, right? And they're not allowed to speak up about this for many reasons, because they would soon be characterized or misrepresented as participating in a certain lifestyle that they don't emulate. But because they have been victimized, then the question all of a sudden comes up, am I not heterosexual anymore? So those kind of conversations can really cloud the picture. Some of the other research is based on quantitative versus qualitative studies. When we have the ECPAT study, for instance, which has some really good quality outcomes that inform us about things as to why socially we still don't want to see boys as victims. We don't want to see that as potentially being a part of our culture, that people are victimizing our young men. But when you look at the depth of the study, it was 40 people that they had interviews with, and they did more of a qualitative kind of analysis, and they had some really good outcomes. But again, it was a snapshot with some applications that have been pretty globalized. And so the issues of cultural norms and the issues of what we will and won't look at begin to cloud our vantage point, and we've got to keep taking snapshots at different times in different places with different people so that we start to put together a composite that helps us to identify where we're weak, as well as to identify an understanding of the issues with more depth. And you can't take any one of them as your only way of measuring. So one study says there's 68%. Okay, we got that. Another study says 40%. There's this national conversation that says, well, it's 80% girls and 20% boys. We've got to start rethinking that and stop relying on a single study, but really do an analysis of the whole. Did I get to the ask of the question?
So we rely, Andrea Sparks, our director, and the rest of our team rely upon Tomi's role to either push back against some research that we stumble upon, or to take the deeper dive, to pick it apart, to understand it better, to find its flaws as well as its strengths, so that we don't abandon it out of hand if there's some takeaways. That's an example. So 3 things that she just talked about, again, takeaways, to make sure that you're aware of, really have to do with the culture of everybody in this room and many who are not, and how we see these males as not being able to be victims. She referred to agency. The second clearly has to do with the way that we ask the questions, the way we are only beginning to bring light into the darkness, because most of you know already, because Dr. Boucher's been doing this work for a long time on this campus and on different shores entirely, as well as across the country, to again bring light into trafficking broadly. Where there is still a tremendous amount of darkness is this topic about boys. So thank you for not going somewhere else to grab a bite to eat, because this is now the topic that has yet to find a stable footing, even in the questions that we ask. We're at that level of infancy, which means those of you who are still enrolled, undergrad or graduate, here or elsewhere, have some real opportunity to drive some amazing things, because that's the level of infancy, the early development that we are at on this part of the topic. And the third piece, which I think really matters, has to do with just the whole idea of masculinity, and that's come up a couple of times already today. And again, how trafficking fits into that notion of boys, being men, being masculine enough, etc. I want to take the extension of the question to what some of you know are care coordination processes, care coordination teams that have been developed, Tarrant, Dallas, Harris, Bear, some other places where we try to put all the players together, starting with law enforcement, working through the systems, juvenile justice, child welfare, and then into the service provision, and then extending into the prosecution side. So I'm going to ask Matt Gilbert, who didn't, I don't think, mention that he's got a long and storied history with Child Protective Services on both the investigations and other sides of that equation. Talk about how difficult it is to serve boys generally, either in child welfare or now in the role of care coordination.
Well, as Alan and Tomi just mentioned, boys as victims is not really a widely accepted thing. Even by DFPS or the Department of Family and Protective Services or Child Protective Services, we've heard the stats that 1 in 4 girls will be sexually abused, 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused. But that 1 in 6 really doesn't ring with us real well. Even as an investigator, as my time as an investigator, I investigated sexual abuse cases. And when a boy was the victim of sexual abuse, especially a teen, sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around, is this teen a victim? And because of the way that some of these teens interact with us, and now we know that that's related to the trauma that they've experienced. Some of the things that they say might be shocking. Some of the things that they do might be shocking. They may be trying to run away and are certainly not presenting themselves as a victim of any type of abuse, much less child sex trafficking. And so sometimes for our partners, we walk into coordination understanding that these boys have experienced trauma just like their girl counterparts. We know that we're going to respond as a coordinator in the same way to make sure that our partners are communicating, to make sure that information is being shared, and to also provide some education to our partners about the trauma that these boys have experienced. Because we understand that again, the idea of a boy as a victim is not necessarily something that just jumps right off the page. In fact, it hasn't been that long ago that the girls who were involved in commercial sex trafficking were not always treated as victims. And so it's not too much of a leap to believe that seeing a boy as a victim wouldn't be just that much harder. So we do a lot of education around that. Again, we work with our partners. We help them to understand. One of the unique things about our position is that we don't necessarily have to take a client-facing role, and so we can kind of sit back and look at these cases, and I know a lot of you are thinking, oh my goodness, well, why would you want to do this if you can't get involved and get hands-on? We serve our clients through our partners, and so a lot of that is just education. A lot of it is facilitating communication and discussion, and we know that these struggles are real for them. We know that the trauma is real for the child, and we're going to help them understand that as they do their important work.
Thank you. George, can you speak to your experience with the advocate agencies working with boys, and touch on, if you would, what you see as a difference when engaging with families of boys, although I know there's likely to be very limited experience with that.
Well, I think one of the things that does help us, whether the research tells us a concrete number of how many young men are being exploited, when we start to recognize the vulnerabilities, situational vulnerabilities of poverty, of inappropriate housing, of family, domestic violence, abuse, drug abuse in the home. Those things are the contributors that put a child in that place where potentially they find themselves making a run to something better than what they've experienced. And homelessness is one of those huge vulnerabilities for our young people. And so when they're on the street, they're going to use what they have at their devices in order to find a place to spend the night or to fill their bellies with food. And so as we've recognized with young women, we see with young men this transaction for survival of a sexual nature. The dynamic of parents, and this is not born out of the experience that we've had with the few cases that we've had, but I'm aware of, is that oftentimes a child that identifies as LGBTQ may not have a bed at the home they were born in because of the family's dynamics. And that is putting these children at particular risk as they are now put out to the street. And there we have perpetrators that are looking to exploit them.
So let's stay with that and transition from what George just talked about. Most of us on this panel and others certainly in the room have a habit, I do, of pointing out the takeaways. So here's a takeaway that George just referred to. The common perception out there is that boys being involved in trafficking are members of the LGBT community, that they are trafficking because that's part of their lifestyle. That is part of their identity, that they're having male-on-male sexual activity, for example. That is only in the last decade being debunked. Very, very hard is that being debunked, because that's part of what Tomi referred to earlier as identity difficulties. If I, before being trafficked, identified as a heterosexual male, especially if I'm in my teens or young adulthood, and now 5 or 7 times a day I'm involved in sexual activity, being trafficked, mostly, maybe not fully or all the time, with men, that creates an identity crisis for me. But what we're now learning is that it is homelessness first that is the primary issue. So one of the things that we are beginning to learn, Love 146 has recently published a study that talks about maybe the number one service needed is family services, family preservation work, family counseling services, social services that keep the family together, that reduce the rejection from the home so that that male does not become homeless, because it is homelessness that seems to rise above all as a correlate for trafficking activity. So knowing that, going back to Erin and to Matt, what do we have available in terms of services, specifically residential services for boys, but also family work for boys that are experiencing trafficking?
Family work, not much, unfortunately. Well, residential services, obviously our drop-in center is a huge coup for Bexar County, and I think every region should have a 24-hour drop-in center for runaway homeless youth. They need to know that there's a place they can go at any time. We have a lot of kids that come back willingly on their own, 3, 4, 5 times. And for those of you who work with this population, you know that on average it takes a victim 7 times to leave their pimp before they finally decide to leave for good. So the goal of the drop-in center is to create that home that they might not have otherwise had, and make it a warm environment. And when you come in, you know, it's pretty, it smells good, there's good food, there's there's a big screen TV. It feels like the home that they always wanted to have. So creating that home for them that they can go to anytime they want is so crucial, because you're keeping them off the street. And we're finding that they're talking to each other. There's kids coming in saying, I heard about your place from so-and-so. When I was there last Saturday moving my stuff into my new office, a girl, she not escaped, because it's not a lockdown, the Clarity Guidance emotional, she has some emotional, what's it called? Yes, she eloped, is that what you say? Okay. Well, she snuck out of the facility that she was supposed to be in, and she hitchhiked to Centro Seguro, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of Centro Seguro. I'm glad she got there in one piece, but she left the facility and came to us, and she was just frustrated with everything and wanted to talk. She needed a timeout, a pause, as my new boss, Dr. Strench, calls it, and to just reassess the situation. And eventually she went back. The SAPD came and escorted her back. So, but knowing that the kids in their worst, darkest times, they know that that's there 24 hours a day, that's going to save so many kids. And so if you can get this up and running in your community, you get your chief juvenile probation officer on board, and you have him or her go to the chief of police and the sheriff and say, I'm not taking any more runaways in my detention center. You're taking them to the drop-in center. That's it, no more. And they just automatically do it. They don't even think about it. We don't get kids in detention anymore for runaway. So again, it's a collaboration, creating that home for these children. For the families, that's kind of our next step in the big picture of care coordination in Bexar County. We're finding that kids who are in placement, they're coming back out. So they've gotten all the services they need in placement and the rehabilitation, but they're going right back into the environment that made them leave in the first place. And no one in the home is prepared for this. So we've been talking with BCFS Health and Human Services about doing an advocacy program for the families and the children while their kids are away, to work with them and start integrating the children back in the home in the best manner possible, to advocate for them in the schools when the schools don't want to take them back. You know, that's illegal. You have to. And they don't know their rights. So we're working on programs now that will give the families the tools they need to assist their children and to enable the child to want to be at home and not run away again. So that's definitely our next step, but right now we don't have anything set in stone.
And as George mentioned before, a lot of these boys and youth who are victims of sex trafficking don't have the opportunity to go home. They're not welcome in their home for whatever reason, and we see this especially in cases of transgender youth. Sometimes their families have just completely lost touch with them and lost interest in having them around. And so unfortunately the last straw, if you will, when there is no protective caregiver, is for an agency, one of our partners, law enforcement, Traffic 911, somebody that's involved with this youth, to call CPS, to call Protective Services and say, and there's this misconception that, if I call CPS, everything's going to be fine. They're going to find a placement for this child, no problem. But what we know is that boys who are victims of trafficking, transgender youth, they spend a lot of time in a CPS office waiting for placement, some up to 30 days, some even longer. DFPS or CPS has just as much trouble finding placement for these youth as any other agency. And so that's certainly a gap, placement availability for especially boys who have been trafficked. I think the other big gap, Alan, is that you mentioned is family services, and I think from a DFPS perspective, there are limited resources in the Family-Based Safety Services program. All of my DFPS colleagues out there, you're aware of that, and you know that FBSS is something that gets kind of the bottom dollar in the barrel, and unfortunately there aren't the resources for specialized care in these cases. One of the things that we're doing at Dallas CAC is we now have a parents group for children who are high-risk youth or confirmed victims of child sex trafficking. In fact, we have a group tonight that meets tonight. We actually have a mom in that group who is the mother of a teen boy who is a multi-state victim of child sex trafficking. And so that group just started within, I believe, the last month or so, and so we're hoping for great success there. We know that family support and family preservation is a gap, and we're hoping to, with our services, be able to fill that gap a bit.
Can I chime in? Just an emerging group right here in Tarrant County is beginning a family advocacy group to bring parents together to collaborate, to share the heartache and burden, because though we talk at broad brush about family dynamics, oftentimes survivors of sex trafficking come from families just like yours and mine, and parents that love that child deeply and want the best for that child. And when we can stand alongside them as a community and help that parent, I think especially in group sessions, to say, I'm not the only parent in town that has endured this horrible thing for my child. And so I'm so thrilled for Gigi to begin that work, and I think there will be many parents that will feel the support of others as they look for services and support each other.
So to make sure that everybody in the room is aware, before I say this, I want to remind you, if you have a question, I'd be glad to come by and pick it up. Just hold your hand up, and I will come and get it from you. You all certainly should be aware of the amazing work being done by Dr. Cross, who is not here. He presented earlier this morning, as well as his team. I know that Kimberly and Allie and others are here from that team. With regard to TBRI, specifically on rejection because of LGBT or transgender in particular, identification issues, Caitlin Ryan with the Family Acceptance Project at San Francisco State University is an absolutely amazing principal investigator and curriculum developer. That is something that you ought to look at if you don't already have familiarity with it. That's Caitlin with a C, and that specifically goes to homelessness created by identifying with the LGBT community and the ensuing family rejection. It is important to be trauma-informed. It's not enough, but it's an important start to make sure that these boys, certainly, and girls as well, would be served. So what I'd like to do in the 5 minutes or so that we have left is just find out if there's anything that you all would want to share briefly as we close today, to make sure that something is left with our audience, the takeaways that I might not have pointed out or that you might not have been asked to respond to. Tomi?
Give it a second there. One of the things that I think we all need to be cognizant of is our language, and trust-based relational interventions, TBRI, helps us to do a framework of what that looks like, just a wee bit. But even in the research, we have to be aware of what language does to help us to address this issue. We have almost successfully turned the media from child prostitute to prostituted child. Almost successfully. If you see it, you need to be calling out those people who are using language that's inappropriate and put them on notice that this is not acceptable to call a child a prostitute, because that's not, it doesn't exist. And when we talk about language with each other, one of the things that I know that we're striving to do with TBRI and the See It tool and other things that we are attempting to take statewide is to make sure that we're all talking the same language, because we could all have different ideas about things, and that's one of the things that research will help us to identify the difference between a runaway and a throwaway child, and help us to understand the language that we can all get on the same page about. We would never hear an orchestra that didn't all start at the upper left-hand corner and know what the notes are before they start playing, right? So that's a part of the challenge for us, is making sure that we dialogue with one another, we hold each other accountable to our language, that we really review the literature, the research, and the news stories well, so that we see where it's misinforming people and help to correct that course.
Thank you.
There's a lady with some cards up over there.
Great. We have about 2 minutes, so we'll take just a couple of questions and try to answer quickly. This one, in the Metroplex, most shelters will not take teenage boys. Families are faced to make the boys stay on the men's side by themselves. What can this symposium do to help families? Who'd like to respond to that? In the Metroplex, most shelters will not take teenage boys. Families are left to make the boys stay on the men's side by themselves, so separated from their mother or their other family members. What can we suggest might be an answer to that?
Well, I'll say that our experience here in Dallas-Fort Worth, that is not the case. With our partners at Promise House and ACH, those are programs that accept boys and girls with trauma-informed caregivers and support systems, and invite our advocates into those places, our prevention programming. So I'm not aware that that is an issue here in this community.
I think where that's probably an issue is in domestic violence shelters specifically, where families are likely to come, a single parent would arrive with
So
children.
maybe a family homeless shelter, is that?
Correct, that's
Okay.
correct.
So I'm speaking about youth homeless shelters. So an unaccompanied adult, a child, can be placed in our facilities at ACH and at Promise House and be appropriately cared for by themselves. I'll have to...
So the answer really is, again, to focus on the use of youth shelters rather than necessarily adult family shelters. This next question is, what have been your experiences working with trans youth that identify as male? How can trans youth easily navigate emergency shelters, drop-in, or other long-term services?
So one of the things I did when I was wearing my legal hat at juvenile probation is I was in charge of implementing the unfunded mandate of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, but we were all on board, every juvenile probation department is, and I had to do a lot of training in LGBTQI children coming into detention. And the procedures that detention or juvenile probation implemented are the same that we're using at our drop-in center. We sit down with the child, we ask, if they identify as a boy or man, or if he identifies as a girl or woman, we respect that and we honor it. At juvenile detention, they'll put them in the housing with whom they feel comfortable, so long as the safety of others and themselves is preserved. We absolutely respect that. We let them shower separately if they want to. I remember detention, we had girls who identified as boys and wanted to wear the boys' jumpsuit, the uniforms, but we had to tell them they had to at least wear a bra because it was distracting to the boys. So there are some give and take, but for the most part, it's about respecting what the child feels most comfortable with, so long as the safety of other children and that child are protected. And it really hasn't been a big deal. What is interesting is when you get a child come in detention, she identifies as a male, and then the next time she's detained, she identifies as a female. But we honor that, you know, that's the phase of their life right now, and they're going through a lot, and we're implementing that at the drop-in center too. So I would just encourage, it's actually a good resource, and it's a short statute, the Federal Prison Rape Elimination Act. There is a section in there on how to treat LGBTQ children when they come into your facility and how they should be given certain accommodations. It's actually really helpful, and I think it could apply across the board to residential and emergency shelters.
And locally, ACH Shelter has built a fairly new facility that has separate rooms that are neutral. So again, these are separate from the boys' wing or the girls' wing that allow, as the youth self-identifies, them to be in a space that is safe for them. Thank you very much for your time and attention at lunch, and thank you to our panel.